Prince William notices a homeless veteran. What he does next surprises everyone. Near the entrance of a busy station, where footsteps echoed off wet concrete and traffic horns moaned in the distance, a man sat hunched between two overflowing bins. His coat was threadbare. His boots, once polished with pride, now bore the wounds of years past and battles fought both abroad and at home. His hands, cracked and swollen, clutched a cardboard sign. Royal Army Veteran. Anything helps. His name was Thomas, though no one had spoken it aloud in a long time. Most passers-by didn't look. Some glanced, then looked away faster. A few tossed coins without slowing their stride. And then came a different voice, a sharper one. "Move along, mate." A security guard in a reflective vest towered above him, scowling. He kicked at the base of the cardboard sign. "You're scaring the tourists. This isn't a shelter." Thomas didn't move. His eyes stayed down, as if the words were only echoes now. "I'm not hurting anyone," he said, barely above a whisper. "You're an eyesore," the guard snapped. "Go beg somewhere else." "I served this country," Thomas muttered. "In the sand, in the blood. For nothing." But the guard wasn't listening. He turned, gesturing to another officer down the street, already reaching for his radio. And then the world shifted quietly, but completely. A black Range Rover pulled up to the C curb. Two security men stepped out, quickly scanning the area. And then he appeared tall, composed, wrapped in a dark navy coat, a scarf tucked neatly into his collar, a calm presence that somehow cut through the drizzle without a single word. Prince William. He was expected at a nearby school for a mental health campaign. A visit scheduled, press alerted, cameras positioned. But that wasn't where his eyes landed. Instead, they fixed on the growing tension by the station wall. Without hesitation, he walked toward it. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, voice steady, not loud, but unmistakably firm. The guard turned, startled. "Your Highness, I didn't realize—" William raised a hand, silencing the stammer. His gaze shifted to the man on the ground. Thomas blinked up slowly, confusion clouding his face. Rain clung to his beard, and for a second he looked as though he might disappear entirely. "What's your name?" William asked. "Thomas," he replied after a beat. "Thomas Riley." William's eyes caught the chain around his neck. A dog tag, and just faintly, the inked emblem of the Royal Regiment still visible on his wrist. "You served?" William asked gently. "Afghanistan, 2007 to 2011. William didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, as if that answered everything, and then, slowly, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a steaming paper cup. He'd been handed it minutes earlier, but hadn't touched it. "Here," he said. "It's still hot." Thomas hesitated. "You don't have to—" "I want to," William replied, sitting beside him on the bench, rain and all. But this wasn't just about offering a coffee. It was about what came next. The cardboard said, "Royal Army Veteran," but the story behind it was far heavier. Years of silence clung to Thomas like the rain soaking through his blanket. His body sat in London, but his mind was scattered across desert sand and nights without sleep. He didn't look like the man he once was, but William could see something deeper. Prince knelt slightly, lowering himself to Thomas's level. No entourage, no camera flash, just eye contact, just presence. "This is for you," William said, handing him the cup of black coffee. Thomas hesitated. "You don't have to." "I want to," William replied again, gently. And he stayed there, not as a prince performing charity, but as a man choosing to sit beside someone the world had learned to overlook. The steam curled from the coffee between them as the drizzle blurred the city behind. The sounds of London, normally deafening, seemed to fade into the background. Thomas sipped, his hands shaking slightly. "People don't stop. Not anymore," he said. "They see the sign and just look away." William didn't interrupt. "I came back in 2011, Thomas continued, voice gravelly. "Afghanistan, 4 years. Sand, heat, loss, then nothing. Got off the plane, and I was just nobody." The words were soft, but they landed hard. William nodded slowly. "I used to wear a uniform too," he said. "Didn't wear it long, but I remember what it felt like. Clear purpose, clean lines. People looked at you? Thomas looked over, surprised. You wore it different, though. You had a castle to go back to. William didn't smile. He didn't argue. He met the truth where it stood. Some wounds don't bleed, he said after a pause. But they still hurt. A brief silence hung between them. Thomas shifted, uncomfortable with how seen he felt. Look, I don't want your pity. You're not getting pity, William said, voice even. You're getting seen. The words didn't echo. They sank. Slowly, deeply. Thomas blinked a few times, fighting back something he hadn't felt in years: validation. They sat there as people passed, by some glancing, most oblivious. But the two men remained, a prince and a veteran, shoulder to shoulder in the rain. There was no performance, no rush to fix, only shared space. Finally Thomas whispered, "Why are you really here?" William's answer was quiet. "I was heading. To a school? To talk to kids about emotions, about speaking up when things hurt." He paused, looking around at the grayness of the street. "Seems like the lesson started early today." Thomas gave a soft laugh, small but real. "Prince of bloody empathy." William let the line land and nodded once. "I'll take that as a compliment." But something in William's demeanor said, this wouldn't end here. No cameras, no flashing lights, no royal speech or press team nearby, just a prince, a bench, and a promise waiting to unfold beneath a misty London sky. William stayed seated beside Thomas, unmoved by the drizzle seeping through his coat. This wasn't a performance. It wasn't charity. It was presence, the kind that couldn't be staged. Most royals kept to the script. William didn't seem to have one. For a while, neither man spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it was necessary. The kind that holds space for something real to grow. Thomas finally broke. "It? You sure you're supposed to be doing this?" His voice was quieter now, almost cautious. William tilted his head slightly. "Doing what?" "Sitting here. With me. Like this." "I'm not here as a prince," William said. "I'm just someone who saw something wrong and didn't want to walk past it." Thomas looked at him, trying to decipher the sincerity. People usually say stuff like that when there's a camera around. William reached into his coat, pulled out a slim notepad and a pen. He didn't rush. He scribbled something down carefully, tore the page, then folded it once. "This isn't for today," he said, slipping the note into the inside pocket of Thomas's coat. "It's a start." Thomas blinked. "Why are you doing this?" The question came from a place deeper than curiosity. It came from years of being ignored. William met his eyes. "Because if we forget our veterans," he said, quietly, "we forget our soul." The words didn't linger in the air. They landed like an anchor. Thomas stared ahead, the weight of them settling somewhere behind his ribs. For the first time in a long while, something cracked through the fog that lived inside him. A flicker. Not trust, not belief. But maybe hope. He looked at the folded note tucked inside his coat, like it might burn him. "You don't even know me." William smiled faintly. "I know enough." The wind picked up slightly, tugging at William's coat. Neither of them moved. "You're different," Thomas said after a beat. "I get that a lot," William replied. There were no grand gestures, no photos to post, no headlines being crafted in real time. Just two men sitting still in the middle of a world too busy to notice. And somewhere in the space between a shared coffee and a shared silence, something had shifted, not just in Thomas, but in William too. And while the world rushed by, something had already changed in both men. The rain hadn't stopped. It still tapped against the windows like a quiet reminder of everything left unsaid. But inside the black SUV, Prince William sat in silence, eyes fixed on the glass as droplets slid down in slow-motion trails. He didn't speak right away. The city outside kept moving, but something inside him had paused. He wasn't thinking about cameras or his next public appearance. He was thinking about a man on a bench and what it meant that he had walked away from him with nothing more than a coffee and a promise. Then, softly, he spoke. "I saw a man fall today," he said, not looking at anyone in particular. His aide, seated beside him, glanced up. "Sir?" William's voice was quiet but steady. "Not just Thomas. Before, Essex. You remember Vice Lord Lieutenant, Douglas Hughes? Of course, sir, William nodded slowly. Full ceremonial dress, sword, boots, the works. But just as he stepped back to make way for us, he tripped over a bollard. Fell hard. Right in front of the press. The kids. Everyone. The memory played behind his eyes not as a scandal, but as something much more intimate. I didn't think. I just moved. Reached out and helped him up. He tried to laugh it off, said, "Sorry about that." And I told him, "It's all right." He paused, then looked over. Because it was. You know why? The aide stayed quiet. Because I didn't see a mistake. I saw a man who's served this country his whole life. And he deserved to be lifted. Not judged, not stared at. Lifted. There was weight behind the words now. Not frustration, conviction. Without another word, William reached into his coat, pulled out his phone, and scrolled to a number he hadn't dialed in years. His thumb hovered over it for a second, then tapped. It rang twice. Captain Lewis speaking. A voice from the past one shaped by shared experience. "Dan," William said. "It's Will." A beat. Surprise on the other end. "Your Highness, it's been a while." "It has," William replied, "but I need a favor." "Go on." "I met someone today, a fellow vet, Thomas Riley, Royal Regiment. He's been sleeping rough, for years." The line went quiet. Dan didn't need more context. "I need to get him off the pavement," William continued. "Not a warm drink, not a handshake. A real place. Somewhere safe, quiet. With people who understand." Dan's voice came back, calm and ready. "There's a pilot program. Discreet. Former soldiers. Few beds. Trauma-informed care. We can get him in today." William let out a slow breath. "Perfect. I'll bring him myself." He hung up, then turned to the aide. "Before we go to the school, there's one more stop. But words are just words. Unless someone returns, most never come back. But this prince did." The rain had thinned to a mist now, a softer rhythm in the background of the city's endless motion. Thomas hadn't moved much. Still on the same bench, still holding the empty coffee cup, though now he gripped it like it carried something more than warmth, maybe memory. He hadn't expected anyone to return, especially not him. But then he saw the same tall figure approaching, steady, familiar. No flashing lights, no crowd. Just the same navy coat. The same presence that had once sat beside him without hesitation. "You came back?" Thomas asked, disbelief cutting through the roughness in his voice. William gave a small nod, as if returning was the most natural thing in the world. "I said I would, didn't I?" Thomas looked away, trying to bury the shock before it showed. People always said things they didn't mean. This felt different, but still, the years had taught him to doubt kindness. William didn't force conversation. He sat down again right beside him, picking up right where they'd left off. Same bench, same man. But something in Thomas's posture had shifted, shoulders just a bit higher, eyes not so sunken. "I made a call," William said after a quiet moment. "There's a place, not a shelter, a program, run by former soldiers. It's clean, quiet, safe. And it's ready for you if you want it." Thomas stared forward, still processing. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking under the weight of it. "You don't know me. I could be anyone." William didn't blink. "You wore the same flag I did," he said softly. "That's all I need to know." Silence filled the space again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of something Thomas hadn't felt in years. Something soft, real, crushing almost. His breath hitched once, then again. And then, without sound, the tears came. They weren't wild or loud. They weren't even visible to those walking by. But William saw them. The kind of tears that don't scream, they surrender. Thomas lowered his head, shaking slightly. "I don't cry," he whispered, almost to himself. "Didn't cry when I lost my brother. Didn't cry when I lost my house. Not even when I lost myself." William didn't move, didn't look away. "Just let the moment be. You don't have to be strong right now," he said gently. "You've done your time." Thomas nodded, slowly brushing a hand across his face, like clearing away the past. He looked up again, eyes rimmed with red, but clearer than before. Something inside him, unseen by the world for too long, had just shifted. And with a single nod, Thomas stood not just on his feet, but into a new life. It wasn't a shelter. It was a second chance. The building stood quietly on the edge of the city, its modest brick exterior hiding what Thomas never imagined he'd find inside. Peace. No fluorescent buzz, no barking orders, just soft lighting, warm air, and the smell of real food drifting through the halls. A woman in her 50s met him at the door with a calm smile. "Welcome, Mr. Riley. We've been expecting you." Thomas nodded, unsure of what to say, so he said nothing. But she didn't need words. She motioned him gently inside. The walls were painted a soft blue, not institutional, but calming. Pictures lined the hallway, portraits of men and women like him, wearing tired eyes and quiet smiles. Veterans, survivors. Not stories of war, but stories of healing. He was led to a private room, not big but clean. A single bed with fresh linen, a wooden desk, a closet with empty hangers. For a man who'd spent years with nothing but the weight of his own coat, it felt surreal. Later that day he underwent a medical checkup. No clipboard judgment, no rush, just care. "You've been walking on a fractured toe," the nurse said softly. "You must have been in a lot of pain," Thomas shrugged. "Got used to it." But even that sentence sounded strange now. Trauma-informed, counselor introduced herself. "Whenever you're ready," she said. "Not before." Another staff member handed him a warm meal: chicken, potatoes, something green. He hadn't tasted food like that in years. In the dining room, other veterans sat scattered around small tables, some younger, some older, some chatting softly, some silent, but all of them looked up as he entered. No one stared. No one asked questions. One man scooted over and gestured at the seat beside him. "You like football?" he asked. Thomas paused. "I used to." The man grinned. "Still time to start again." They ate in silence after that, and it was the best kind of silence shared, not forced. In the lounge later, Thomas sat by the window watching the trees sway gently in the wind. He wasn't thinking about where he'd sleep tonight. He wasn't calculating how long it would take for someone to ask him to leave. For the first time in years, he was observing the world, not just surviving it. There was a television mounted on the wall in the background. He wasn't paying much attention, not at first. But then he heard a voice he recognized. Calm, steady, familiar. And his eyes shifted to the screen. But the biggest breakthrough didn't come from a therapist. It came from a TV screen. One sentence on TV pierced years of silence. The lounge was quiet, save for the low hum of the news. Most of the men weren't really watching. Background noise had become part of life. But something about the tone shifted. Something in the voice drew attention. Thomas glanced up at the screen. There he was again. Prince William, seated cross-legged on a classroom floor, surrounded by children in uniform. No grandeur, no stiffness. Just presence. The camera zoomed in, slightly, as one student spoke about her parents' divorce. Another boy mentioned being bullied. A third struggled to describe what it felt like to carry sadness and not know what to do with it. William listened. Not with rehearsed nods or polite encouragement, but truly listened. His eyes didn't flick away. His posture didn't shift. He gave each child the full weight of his attention. Then he spoke. "I think we need to end the old-fashioned idea that feeling down is something to be ashamed of. Talking about our emotions doesn't make us weak. It makes us real." The sentence cut clean through the room. Thomas stared at the screen, unmoving. William continued, his voice calm and direct. "Whether you're 12 or 60, whether you're starting school or starting over in life, what matters is knowing you're not alone." The words sat heavy in Thomas's chest. Not painful, not sharp. Just heavy like truth pressing gently against a door that had been locked for years. He hadn't said it out loud. Not to anyone. Not even to himself. That maybe, just maybe, he wasn't okay, and it was okay to say it. The segment played on, with other students sharing stories, and William responding with calm encouragement. But Thomas wasn't hearing them anymore. He was hearing the words that had broken something open. Not alone. He blinked hard, then looked down at his hands, clean now, not cracked. Holding nothing but still trembling slightly. A quiet voice beside him nudged him back. "You all right?" another veteran asked, soft but present. Thomas nodded, then stopped. "No," he said. "Not really." There was no shame in the words, just honesty. "I think—" He hesitated, then let it go. "I think I want to talk to someone." The man nodded like he'd been waiting to hear that for a long time. Thomas stood slowly, steadying himself. Not because of weakness, but because of the weight of a decision finally made. He turned and walked toward the hallway, past the portraits of those who had come before him. His feet felt heavier, but his chest felt lighter, and though no one followed, everyone noticed. And with that, his silence began to unravel. From voiceless to heard, his journey was far from over. The door to the counselor's office closed softly behind him. No locks, no pressure, just a space. A quiet space where truth didn't have to be shouted to be heard. Thomas sat across from a woman who didn't ask questions too quickly. She waited. She watched. And when he didn't speak right away, she didn't fill the silence. That's how he knew she understood. Eventually, it came. Slowly. Carefully. Not all at once, but in waves. He talked about Afghanistan. About the noise. The heat. The way the air always smelled like tension and dust. He talked about his brother, his best friend killed on patrol 6 months before his own return. He talked about getting off the plane and realizing the world had moved on without him. He didn't cry, not at first, but each word scraped something loose, something rusted shut a long time ago. Grief, rage, shame, loneliness. The kind that eats your name, your voice, your worth. The counselor said little, but what she did say stuck. You were trained to be strong. That doesn't mean you don't deserve softness. And something shifted. The next week, he started showing up to the skills room. Quiet at first, just watching, then hands-on learning the angles of a welding torch, the balance of logistics charts, the steady grip needed to work in security. His hands remembered. His focus sharpened. He wasn't just passing time, now he was building something. At lunch, he started sitting with the same group of men. They didn't talk about the past much, but when they did, it wasn't for pity. It was for perspective. "You did 3 tours?" one asked. Thomas nodded. "Made it back with my boots, but not much else," the man chuckled. "You made it back. That's the part that matters." And Thomas smiled not politely but genuinely. There were still hard days, mornings where the weight returned, where the memories came uninvited. But the silence no longer suffocated him. Now it was a pause he could step through. He was no longer a shadow of who he used to be. He was someone rebuilding with steel in his hands, stories in his eyes, and purpose in his chest. The program didn't turn him into someone new. It reminded him of who he had always been. Not forgotten, not broken. Just waiting to be seen again. But healing in silence is one thing, stepping into the light is another. The man once ignored on a bench now stood under chandeliers. The hall at Kensington Palace shimmered with candlelight. Silver trays glided between guests. Strings played gently. In the corner, royals, dignitaries, military leaders all gathered for an evening honoring the quiet courage of Britain's unsung heroes. And there, standing tall at the edge of the marble staircase, was Thomas Riley. His suit was sharp. Dark navy, fitted just right. His beard was trimmed, hair clean cut. A small poppy pin clung to his lapel, a nod to the life he'd once lived and nearly lost. Beside him stood 2 other veterans from Haven House. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their bond was written in everything they'd survived, as the host called his name. Thomas stepped forward. Each step toward the podium was measured. Confident. The way soldiers walk when they're carrying something important. But this time, it wasn't a weapon. It was his story. He reached the microphone, looked out at a sea of polished shoes and polished reputations, and for a moment, the old fear crept in, but it passed. He took a breath and began. 6 months ago, I was sleeping under an overpass, cold, forgotten, holding a sign no one wanted to read. The room stilled, crystal glasses lowered, heads turned. I served my country, came home to nothing, lost my family, my health, my name. He paused, voice trembling but firm. And then someone saw me. A few murmurs stirred, unsure where he was going. But Thomas didn't waver. It wasn't a politician. It wasn't a headline. It was a man. In a coat. Holding a cup of coffee. A man who sat beside me in the rain without saying much. Because he didn't need to. His voice caught for a second. Then he said it. He didn't save me with his crown. He saved me with his heart. The words echoed off the gold-framed portraits. And then, quietly, the room rose to its feet. Applause not loud, but heavy with meaning. And from behind the velvet curtain, Prince William stepped onto the stage. No fanfare, no announcement, just a nod. He didn't speak. He didn't smile for the cameras. He walked to Thomas and placed a hand on his shoulder, firm, steady, and full of something deeper than status. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. In that moment, it wasn't a prince standing beside a veteran. It was one soldier standing beside another, but headlines couldn't capture the real story. The transformation wasn't over yet. Not every victory makes the news, but it still matters. The days moved slower now. Not in a lazy way, but in a way that felt earned. At Haven House, routine became its own kind of healing. For Thomas, service hadn't ended when the uniform came off. It had just changed shape. He spent most mornings in the shared kitchen, rolling up his sleeves before the sun reached the windows, helping with coffee, folding laundry, wiping tables without being asked. No ceremony, no clipboard, just small acts that made life smoother for someone else, just as someone once had for him. The new arrivals came in quiet waves, some with their heads down, some trying to mask the tremble in their hands. Thomas never greeted them with big speeches. He simply met them where they were. "You'll be all right," he'd say. Not with pity, but with the calm certainty of someone who knew how dark the tunnel had been and how real the light was on the other side. He wasn't a counselor. He didn't need to be. He was something else proof. One afternoon, a young man arrived barely in his 20s, the kind of young that still carries echoes of high school hallways and boot camp mornings. He had a stiffness in his jaw, like letting it loosen would let everything fall apart. Thomas sat beside him at lunch without introducing himself. After a while, he pulled something from his pocket. 2 scratched dog tags, edges worn smooth over. The years. He set them on the table between them. "This," he said quietly, "isn't who I was. It's who I chose to become again." The young soldier didn't answer, but he nodded, and that was enough. There were no reporters around, no gala speeches or headlines, just shared meals, gentle conversations, laughs that returned slowly like guests unsure they were welcome. Every once in a while, someone would try to thank Thomas more than he was comfortable with. "You saved me, mate." He'd shake his head every time. "I just passed it on," he'd reply. Evenings were his favorite. He'd sit on the back steps of the center, tea in hand, listening to the wind shuffle through the trees. He'd think about the bench, the drizzle, the paper cup of coffee, and the man who saw past the dirt, the beard, the silence, and spoke directly to what was left of the soldier inside. He never sought credit. He wasn't interested in being remembered. He was interested in helping someone else forget for just a moment that they were broken. But one question still lingered. Why did Prince William choose him? Every royal has a duty, but this one followed. His heart. The cameras were off this time. No press, no podium, no palace backdrop. Just a quiet room, soft light, and Prince William seated with his hands folded, speaking not as a royal, but as a man reflecting on something that had left its mark. Weeks had passed since the event at Kensington, yet the question still lingered for many. Why, Thomas? William didn't hesitate when asked. "Because I saw something," he said, voice low but steady. "Something I've seen before." He paused, searching for the right words, not rehearsed, but remembered. "When I served, I met men who carried silence like armor. Not because they wanted to, but because it was the only way they knew how to keep going." He looked down at his hands, then back up again. "Sometimes when I walk through the crowds, I see faces that remind me of them. That stare, that stillness, and I know what it means to feel unseen in a world that won't stop moving." He spoke plainly, not for effect, but for truth. "When I saw Thomas, I didn't see a homeless man. I saw a soldier, one who hadn't quit, but who'd run out of places to stand." There was no anger in his tone, just something deeper: recognition. "I didn't go to him to save anyone. I went because something in me said, You know this man. Not his story, maybe, but his silence. For William, the moment wasn't about protocol or plans. It was about something quieter, something closer. We can't lead, he said, if we forget those who followed. And we can't call ourselves a nation if we walk past those who once stood for it. He leaned back slightly, not to retreat, but to let the weight of the thought settle. Empathy isn't weakness, it's responsibility. The kind that doesn't ask what's convenient, but what's right. His voice softened. Thomas didn't need a speech. He needed a seat. He needed someone to see past the beard, the sign, the shame, and speak to the man still holding on. He didn't look for applause. He wasn't trying to prove a point. He was revealing one. A crown can represent power, he said quietly. But compassion, that's what builds legacy. And with those words, something shifted. Not in the air, but in the understanding of what leadership could look like when stripped of tradition and wrapped in humanity. And the next chapter of kindness was already being written. It wasn't royalty that changed a life. It was humanity. 6 months had passed since the drizzle, the bench, the folded note. The man once wrapped in silence and soaked in cold now stood on solid ground. His hands were steady, his eyes clearer. The world hadn't suddenly gotten easier, but he had become stronger within it. Thomas now had a job. A modest flat near the outskirts of the city. A morning routine that began with brewed coffee, not survival instinct. He no longer moved like a ghost, and he no longer lived like one. At Haven House, his presence still lingered not as someone who needed help, but as someone who had become help. And outside those walls, something even bigger was unfolding. Prince William's initiative, once just a private favor, had grown. Quietly. Intentionally. Programs for veterans expanded: more beds, more counselors, more second chances. Not every success story made the headlines, but each one mattered, and people noticed. Not just the press, but the public. Conversations shifted. Leaders looked inward. For the first time in a long time, compassion began to resemble leadership. Not because it was polished, but because it was real. One evening, Thomas stood in the community kitchen helping a new arrival sort through a stack of donated clothes. The man was young, tired, unsure if hope had a place in his life anymore. Thomas placed a clean shirt in his hands and said, almost casually, "You never know who's watching and who's willing to care." The man looked at him, startled by the sincerity. Thomas just smiled. There were no cameras to capture the moment, no articles to recount it. But that didn't make it any less real. Because kindness doesn't need a stage. It doesn't need titles or speeches. It only needs a moment and someone willing to act in it. And sometimes, the most powerful transformations aren't loud. They're whispered, in shared silences, in broken people being seen before they're fixed, in conversations that happen between strangers, with no agenda except dignity. This wasn't a story about a prince. It was about what happens when power sits down beside pain without trying to fix it, without trying to own it, just choosing to be there. And in a world full of noise, that choice echoed louder than any crown ever could, because sometimes all it takes is one kind hand reaching out in the rain.